Welcome to New Jersey Politics with Laura Jones. I'm Laura Jones, and we're so glad to have you here. Today, we are talking all things New Jersey, including the upcoming midterm elections, also changing policy on COVID mandates, and the state's aging roadways, bridges, and railways. John Wisniewski is a former assemblyman and Democratic candidate for governor. He's going to be joining us later in the show, as will Rosemary Becchi. She's heads up Jersey First, an organization that looks at the economic impact of what it is to live life here in New Jersey. First, we welcome Dr. Ben Dworkin to the show. He's the founding director of the Rowan Institute for Public Policy and Citizenship at Rowan University. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today on New Jersey Politics.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's good to see you again.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about what's always changing, and it seems to be guidance from elected officials, the governor particularly, on mandates. So when it comes to mask mandates, a lot of people are very excited that he is lifting mandates, some not so happy. So can you talk a little bit about what you think motivated him to lift the mandates? Is this strictly health related, or is there some politics involved?
Well, mask mandates have become political, even if you make a decision strictly based on science and medical advice. So everything is political at this point. But I think the biggest thing that has changed is the rates of vaccination and the fact that we just have, a year ago, we were talking differently about mask mandates because we had a tiny proportion of the folks who were getting vaccinated. Now that we have had it, now that there are courses of treatment that are being approved, it's a different medical situation. And the other thing I think that has come that affects this decision is just a recognition that there's only so much you can do at a certain point, that this will become not a pandemic, but endemic. Just something we live with, the way we live with the regular flu. People get shots, people don't get shots, we move on. Some people get very sick from the regular flu each year, and we're getting closer to that. And I think that's why we're seeing decisions like this related to opening up and relaxing these mandates, allowing the option if your family, your kids want to continue wearing masks, allowing districts options in terms of what they want to do. But, the reason things are changing are really because of the vaccination rates and just an understanding of we're never going to get to 100% getting rid of COVID. We're just going to have to live with it at some point.
Well, you mentioned it's become political, and most people would agree with that. And Phil Murphy won re-election back in November, but it was not by as large a margin as many would have expected. So some people are, a lot of people are saying, Democrats overall are concerned because the Democrats won in Virginia. They won Republicans won in Virginia. Democrats barely held on in New Jersey. We have midterm elections coming up. So does any of his policy Governor Murphy is doing in New Jersey factor into the congressional midterms?
Not directly. I think it's an indirect connection. The fact is that it's a very tough political environment out there for incumbents, especially Democratic incumbents who are understood to be in charge of both Washington and Trenton. And so in that sense, if the more things get better for everybody, the better that the incumbents will do. But it's a really tough time and very frustrating time. And there's a lot of anger and bitterness out there because of inflation, because of supply chain issues. You can't get a new car the same way you could a couple of years ago. And when you can get it, it's really expensive these days. So things like that are just affecting it. It's really an indirect connection in terms of Governor Murphy's policies and the congressional midterms this November.
You brought up an interesting point about incumbency, and in this case, maybe not working to people's favors, because typically when you're in the incumbent, you've got so much going your way. People want to be the incumbent, but you're saying that this year it may not necessarily work to their benefit.
Well, look, all things considered, every candidate would rather be an incumbent. There are tremendous advantages, not the least of which is just your name recognition is much higher than anybody else who's challenging you. But some years are more difficult for incumbents. Some years are easier. And so this is one of those years where Democratic incumbents, especially because the Democrats control the White House, this is the first midterm of a new presidency historically, with only a couple exceptions over the history of the United States. These midterm elections in the first year of a new president are not good for the president's party. In this case, we don't expect the Democrats to have a great year this year. That happens. So it's a midterm election. So there was always going to be that. But as you mentioned, incumbents usually win anyway. What we're seeing here is that there's a confluence of forces. You have residual bitterness about dealing with COVID. There are any number of issues with inflation, plus the Democrats are in charge, plus the Democrats are in the White House. These things come together, and it can make it for a tough year for Democrats. I think we're going to see a lot of challenging, competitive races in New Jersey. Doesn't mean that the Democratic incumbents are going to lose all of them. It's just that there are going to be, I think, several that will be particularly competitive.
So do you care to talk about what races you think will be competitive and what the issues will be? Will it be all about politics, or are we going to hear about some policy and issues that affect people's everyday lives, from affordability to the cost of living and quality of life?
Yeah, I think each side is going to have some very strategic messages. And what will differ, we'll see the same kinds of things. The Democrats will be saying the same kinds of things. The Republicans will be saying the same kinds of things in New Jersey and largely throughout the country, with little nuances depending on the candidates themselves. So for the Republicans, you're looking, I think they are trying to knock off several Democrats here in New Jersey. The top and what we expect to be the most competitive race will be in District 7, where incumbent Democrat Tom Malinowski looks to be facing off again against the person he beat by a handful of votes 2 years ago, former state senator Tom Kean, who has now left the state Senate. Kean has himself a primary in the district in redistricting, as they redrew the maps to make sure the populations were all equal among our 12 congressional districts. The district got a little bit more favorable for the Republicans. So there's a lot of enthusiasm there. I think nationally that's going to be a very targeted race. But you also have competitive races in the 3rd district, where you have incumbent Andy Kim. He has a particularly better Democratic district after redistricting. It's not nearly as tough as it was 2 years ago, but still, he's only been in a couple terms. This is going to be tough in this particular environment. Mikey Sherrill up in the 11th district, another Democratic incumbent. Josh Gottheimer in the 5th district, another Democratic incumbent. These all used to be Republican districts. Now the map has changed, the lines have changed, and people like Kim and Gottheimer and Sherrill are going to be running in new boundaries that are a little bit more favorable to them. But again, it's the political environment that's going on. And if people are just in a throw the incumbents out mood, they won't care who's running. And that will, and I think that's why all of these races are going to be challenging. We might not see upsets, but they're going to be competitive for sure.
Right. And just final thoughts on that 7th district. It seems to go back and forth between Republicans and Democrats every 6 to 10 years or so. And Tom Kean has got that name recognition because his father was the governor.
Not a lot of, I'm not sure how many people I remember, Governor Kean. You remember Governor Kean. I'm not sure how many other people. Now, and Governor Kean continues to be an elder statesman and highly respected and very active and engaged at a national level, ran the 9/11 Commission, but not everybody, knows him. Tom Kean, the state senator, former state senator, is certainly been there in his own right. But that district, should be clear, it really hasn't gone back and forth. I mean, the 7th was in Republican hands for a while here. So it was only when Malinowski in 2018, along with a bunch of other Democrats around the state, was able to put together a message in a year that was significantly affected by the backlash against the Trump administration here in New Jersey. He was able to win. He was able to win re-election, but it's going to be a very competitive race. It's going to be millions of dollars spent by both sides on that race.
Ben Dworkin, we thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, and we look forward to having you back on sometime soon.
Thank you, Laura. I look forward to that.
Rosemary Becchi is our next guest. She ran for Congress as a Republican a few years back. She founded a group called Jersey First as well, and that organization focuses on the cost of living in New Jersey from being overtaxed to overregulated. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, first, for people who are not familiar, can you talk a little bit about Jersey First, what exactly your group is?
Sure. Jersey First is an issue advocacy organization, and we're fighting for hardworking New Jerseyans in New Jersey. As I said before, we not only educate, but we also advocate for New Jerseyans on issues like education, as well as advocating for lower taxes and less spending. We also advocate for businesses and for the people in the community. We talk a lot about supporting our police, as well as the disabled community and our vets as well.
So a lot of people have called New Jersey the nanny state because there's so many rules and regulations, just so much. So can you talk a little bit about what issues are rising to the top of your radar? I mean, affordability in this state, it seems to be the issue that, across the board people struggle with. Staying here, getting a job here, going to school here. When they retire, can we afford to stay here? So can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on those issues of affordability and what some solutions might be?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually why I founded Jersey First back in 2018. I came home one day and the property tax bill was there, and I opened it up, and once again, the bill had, gone up again. And, I realized that we really got to talk about the need for lowering our spending so that we can lower our taxes. But inherent in that is also, supporting our businesses and eliminating all the regulation that is on our businesses. It really hinders our ability to attract new businesses to the state and to keep our businesses here.
Right. Well, I mean, that is even more difficult in times of a pandemic where there have been more mandates put in place. How many people can come into restaurants? Mask mandates for our schools are lifting, putting that burden back onto local educators, local businesses. So, what are your thoughts on what the governor is doing? Taking away some of the mandates. Does it put more of a burden on the businesses? Or do you see this as a positive thing?
No, I actually see it as a very positive thing. It is really important to eliminate some of those mandates. We've got to support our businesses. As you know, during the pandemic, a third of our small businesses closed, and it's really important that we support our businesses, that we get them reopened. And I think a large part of that is taking off those burdensome mandates, taking them off our businesses.
So how do you strike that balance between ensuring that our roads are maintained, which again, it's going to cost, but without, taxing the people who are actually paying the bills to death before they, haul it to down south?
Yeah, no, it's actually exactly what you just said. It's about balance, right? It's making sure that we're balancing our spending as well as the level in which we are taxing people. And we really in this state got to rein in the spending so that we can make the state more affordable. But I do think that we've got to revisit how we're spending our money. We desperately need to put more money into our infrastructure, absolutely. And so again, we've got to make sure that we're balancing all that and spending our money in the most effective way possible.
Yeah, and having run for office, you have been able to see sometimes when you put out an idea and watching it come to fruition, it's sometimes very difficult because there's so much red tape within state government, federal government. So what are your thoughts on trying to, cut through some of that so people who, when they run, can actually put into place and lawmakers can get to work as opposed to having to deal with so much red tape? How do you address that?
I was very fortunate in my career. I actually worked in the U.S. Senate, and I worked for then Chairman Roth of Delaware, who truly believed in bipartisanship and really reached across the aisle and really worked in a way to make sure that we were coming up with solutions that took into account, different perspectives. And I do think that's an important part of all of this. And I think as I ran for Congress and as others run for public office and stuff, I mean, that is truly a big part of the process, is being able to take a look at what people are proposing and strike a balance in that process. I do think it's very important. And I think, again, as we emerge from, this pandemic, hopefully emerge from it here, that we are looking for solutions that really get our economy going and that are the best for the people of New Jersey.
I think, just final thoughts here. As difficult as the pandemic has been, a lot of parents were able, through the Zoom meetings, they were actually able to hear and listen, see what's going on in children's classrooms. And as a result, have been for better or worse. And I think it's for better. I'll let you end it with this. Parents are definitely more involved with their children's education right now. So final thoughts on the upside, perhaps, of involvement.
No, absolutely. I think that has been, a big benefit of all of this, is that parents have been able to be more engaged in their children's, schooling and curriculum and in their lives. I mean, all of us have different kids and different stories to tell, and this pandemic has, really impacted all of our kids. And so I do think, yes, it's been beneficial to be a part of our children's lives in greater detail, and it's also enabled all of us, including, all the parents that we work with here at Jersey First, to advocate stronger and harder on their behalf.
All right, Rosemary Becchi, we thank you so much with Jersey First. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Happy to.
John Wisniewski is a former Democratic Assemblyman who also ran for governor in 2015. He's here to talk about the state's aging infrastructure as well as other pressing issues in New Jersey. Welcome. So good to see you.
Good to be with you again. Thanks for having me on.
First, let me talk a little bit about a point of view that you have that others in New Jersey don't, and that's to be a Democrat who actually challenged Phil Murphy in the Democratic primary. So why not start and talk about what he was able to accomplish in his first term, or he was not, that you would like to see accomplished, work to be done moving into the second term? Your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll talk to you about the second part of your question, what should be accomplished. And it's an issue that's really been hanging since the last governor, Chris Christie, left office, which was the Transportation Trust Fund. Yes, I know that during Christie's administration, one of the final acts was to renew the Transportation Trust Fund, but it was done in a way that had a terminal date, and it's coming up. And the Transportation Trust Fund, at that point in time, in a year or two, will be out of money. And there has to be a discussion and there has to be a plan, start it now, about how we continue to fund our infrastructure, whether it's roads, rail, bridges, water mains going into homes. We need to have a long-term plan on funding that. And right now we have a long-term plan that expires very soon. So it's not really that much of a long-term plan.
Well, what about the federal infrastructure money that's poised to come into the state? Recently, the vice president was here in Newark visiting with U.S. Senator Bob Menendez, talking about some of the infrastructure and the water in Newark. So how does that pot of money or hopeful funding factor in?
Well, the federal infrastructure legislation that was recently, maybe not so recently, but just relatively recently concluded, provides an additional $1 billion to New Jersey. Now that's parceled out over 5 years. It's $200 million a year. So while that's a lot of money, when you compare it to our annual capital program, which is almost $4 billion between the federal money that comes in and the state transportation trust fund, it's a small amount. And there is such a backlog of infrastructure that has not been addressed for such a long time. That's why, things like the Portal Bridge are 90 years old and the tunnel under the Hudson River is 100 years old, because there are very large projects that just have never had the funding source. And you can go around the state and you can pick deficient bridges, undersized highways, roads that need to be refinished, and the list goes on and on.
So when you're talking about the Transportation Trust Fund and renewing that, taxpayers want to know, well, how does that impact me? What are we talking about? How much does it necessarily involve a tax hike?
Well, that's the great question, because when this was done last, there was a 25-cent a gallon gas tax increase, and then a clause in that gas tax increase that allowed it to increase with inflation and demand and things of that nature. So once you've done that, how do you go back and say, we need another 25 cents, we need another 30 cents? But that's where the discussion has to start. How do we fund as a state? How do we agree that while we need this infrastructure, there has to be some method of paying for it? We've got to figure out what's the fair way of paying for that infrastructure, and who pays and how do they pay? Is it a vehicle mile tax? I know there's proponents and opponents on both sides of that issue. Do we just go back to the tried and true gas tax? Well, with the advent and the increasing number of alternate powered vehicles on the road, is that really a smart way to go? These are discussions that need to be had now.
Well, on that topic of increasing the gas tax, I mean, you bring up a good point about things that are not known, like you said, electric cars. So what do you think the best route, not to play on words, but is the best route to take to addressing that? I mean, is that tax hike inevitable?
Well, I think that if we don't plan as a state, if the legislature and the governor don't get together and start looking at this, what will happen is it will wait till the last minute, and that's usually the low-hanging fruit. If you can't figure out a complicated problem, if you can't figure out a better way of funding this, it's likely to be the default. Let's raise the gas tax again. And I don't know that that's a sustainable way of doing this. And that's why, if we have the time, which we do now, we have a couple of years left, now would be the time to create a task force that starts looking at alternatives. How do we fund it? And what are we funding? Because we fund a lot of money into roads and bridges. And that is when you build a bigger road, its capacity is consumed within a year or two. But we're not spending an equal amount of money on mass transit and making New Jersey Transit the world-class transportation agency it once was. We need to invest a lot more money into New Jersey Transit.
There always seems to be an election. We joke about New Jersey should be called the election state, but we have midterms coming up. And then after that, we'll be having the state assembly up for re-election. So how likely it is, because Phil Murphy is in his second term, he can't run again. How likely is it that you think that these issues will be dealt with, and not till that very last minute when there are no other alternatives but to raise a tax? We got no money. There's no other choice,
Right.
And ultimatum.
So you can take a little bit of a lesson from what happened in the Chris Christie administration, 2 terms. In the second term, Governor Christie was able to do some things that he would never have ventured to do in his first term, one of which was increasing the gas tax for the Transportation Trust Fund. Every governor's fervent wish when they're in their first term is to have a second term. But once they get into that second term, they have more latitude, more flexibility, because at least on a state level, they don't have to worry about another election cycle. That being said, everybody in elected office, Phil Murphy's no exception, always has somewhere in the back of their mind, what's the next act? What's the next office to run for? And so that will always be a constraint on action, no matter who it is. But I think as terms of state policy, Governor Murphy has a little more freedom to act, but he's going to be confronted with a legislature that, as you correctly pointed out, will be running for re-election, and they'll be running for re-election in a new legislative district.
All right, so rounding it out, as I first started our conversation, we were talking a little bit about, what other things were not accomplished that he needs to accomplish, what he needs to do. So I'll let you have the last minute final thoughts on Governor Murphy's second term and what he perhaps left undone from the first time.
Well, there was a lot that Governor Murphy was not able to address because we had this pesky thing called a pandemic. And just as his administration got started, he started looking at ways of retrenching and doing less, and a lot of restrictions were put into place. And I think that distracted from whatever his first term agenda was. I do believe that transportation has to be a major component of it. I do believe funding, making sure that we get our cannabis industry up and running as promised, as promoted. It's not there yet, but we need to do that. And I also think making sure that we continue to fight the fight of property taxes. I just got my tax bill. I'm sure a lot of people did. And property taxes in New Jersey continue to go up. We have to reduce the size of government in New Jersey. And that's certainly something that this governor can address in his second term.
Solomon, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it. It's always good to see you.
It's good to be with you again. Thanks a lot.
And we thank you for watching this edition of New Jersey Politics with Laura Jones. I am Laura Jones, and we will see you next time.